Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest event in the reading series organised by the Writing Seminars programme at Johns Hopkins. I'm Andrew Motion, and it's my very great pleasure and honour to welcome this evening's speaker, the internationally renowned British novelist Ian McEwan. But before I do that, can I say that Mr. McEwan will read for about half an hour, 40 minutes, after which there'll be a chance for you, the audience, to ask him some questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please post it in the chat room for the attention of Kate Kelleher, who will moderate that part of the event as she's done at our previous events. It would be easy, though it would take a while because his achievements are so many, to introduce Ian McEwan by concentrating on the public record, the 17 novels, the 3 volumes of short stories, the 5 screenplays, the oratorio, the libretto, the 11 film adaptations, Atonement and On Chesil Beach being probably the best known of them, the 2 children's books, the 2 plays, and the 1 non-fiction book on science, and the prizes, the Booker Prize for the novel Amsterdam in 1998, the Shakespeare Prize the following year, the James Tait Black Memorial Prize in 2005, the Jerusalem Prize in 2011. As I say, it would be easy to introduce Ian McEwan in this sort of way, and handy too, since it immediately gives a sense of how marvelously much he has done and how widely admired his work has become. But if I were to concentrate on these things and nothing else, it would mean that I missed saying something absolutely crucial about the effect that his novels have on their readers, and one of the main reasons why people like them so much. I mean, while it's true that Ian McEwan is one of the most celebrated novelists of our time, and also true that this elevation has led him to becoming one of our most cogent and sympathetic public intellectuals, whose opinions on world affairs, most recently the horrific war in Ukraine, are always very gratefully received. It's his genius for intimacy that guarantees the impact and memorability of his work. Because of this, I hope you'll think it appropriate if I briefly adopt a more personal tone. When Ian McEwan's first 2 collections of stories were published, First Love, Last Rites in 1975 and In Between the Sheets, 1978, I was in my mid-20s and teaching in the English department at the University of Hull in a remote part of Northeast England. It was my first job. I've never forgotten and never will forget the effects these books had on me, partly thanks to their noirish subjects, which seemed thrilling in their candor and severity, but also thanks to the beautifully engineered mechanics of their style, plain but arresting, demotic but dramatic, and, which is the nub of the point I'm trying to make here, capable of speaking with a disturbingly confiding sort of directness. It had the odd effect of making me feel complicit with the stories, as if they were dealing with subjects that I knew were important to me, but hadn't previously liked to admit. And as though in the creation of these stories, Ian McEwan had found a way of speaking to me and me alone, as if in some profound sense, he'd got my number. I've no doubt, in fact, I'm completely sure, that all his readers felt a version of this same thing, whether we're reading early masterpieces like The Child in Time from 1987, or Enduring Love, 1997, or grave middle period meditations like Saturday, 2005, or On Chesil Beach, 2007, or the more recent and imaginatory fantastical pieces like Nutshell, 2016, or Machines Like Me, 2019, we each of us think, this is my world. I recognize these people. These are the issues that most concern me. And thank God there's someone as lucid and courageous as Ian McEwan to tackle them and reflect on their importance to my existence. And what an enormous range of subjects Ian McEwan covers in his work, not just the mysterious workings of the human heart, which is placed front and center in all his writing, but in the themes which sometimes disrupt and sometimes benefit those workings, our appetite for the macabre, the Second World War and its often guilty-making aftermath, the impact of the Cold War, the bewilderments and opportunities of recent scientific developments, including and especially neuroscience, the impending catastrophe of climate change, the excitement and risk of our embrace of artificial intelligence. I could go on, and I'd like to go on, because naming these themes is a way of thanking and honoring Ian McEwan for the manifold ways in which, with all due modesty, he's become one of the most compelling thinkers of our time, as well as one of our finest stylists. We should all be very grateful for what he's given us, which is a wonderfully complete picture of our moment in time. It's equally wonderful to have you with us this evening, Ian. You're deeply welcome.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Those very, very kind and welcoming words. And good evening, everyone. I'm talking to you from a converted barn in Gloucestershire, which lies about 100 miles west of London. And it's a very rainy evening here. Perfect time and environment to talk about books. I'm going to concentrate exclusively on Atonement tonight. Some of you might have read it, some of you might have seen the movie. And I'm going to mostly concentrate on ideas of the imagination. And I'm going to deal with a question which all writers pretend to hate because it's almost unanswerable. And that question is, and they grimace when someone quotes it to them, where do you get your ideas from? I think it was my friend Martin Amis who facetiously said he got them by roaming around secondhand bookshops and filching plots. And his punishment for that flippant remark was it was taken seriously. I will say nothing of that sort, but I have to say that Atonement started with my doodling in a notebook, and suddenly found myself writing a paragraph about a young woman running into an elegant drawing room with some wildflowers she just picked. And she's looking for a precious vase to put them in. And at the same time, she's very wary of the young gardener outside, a man called Robbie. And I stared at this for a very long time, and in the end decided it was quite obviously a science fiction story. And it was set 200 or 300 years in the future, when elites had abandoned all technology and lived the life of Jane Austen characters with harpsichords, and they sent messages with servants, by way of servants. They rode on horseback, and technology was just entirely the domain of the lower classes. So the young man outside, the gardener, had little diodes in his head that gave him immediate thought access to the internet. Well, this was a terrible idea, but I was determined to write a novella based around it. And then so I got going, and I wrote 3,000 or 4,000 words, and I gave this young woman a younger sister, Bryony, and as soon as she walked onto the page, everything collapsed. And I suddenly remembered what I'd been writing in my notebooks 3 or 4 months previously. And that was, as we came towards the end of the century, the end of millennium, it was about 1997 or 8, I was doing this. I'd written how I'd like to write a novel about how we look back on our own mistakes in that century, as a society, as an individual. And somehow, this young 13-year-old girl walking unbidden onto the page made me understand straight away that it was 1935, and that she was going to make a mistake, and she was going to spend her rest of her writing life trying to put it right. And out of that idea began Atonement. And all that survived of Jane Austen was a passage in my thoughts that comes from an early novel of Jane Austen's, Northanger Abbey. It was the time of the Gothic novel, or Jane Austen was rather making fun of the Gothic novel. And her young heroine, Catherine Morland, sees everything through the prism of the Gothic. She's a kind of early Edgar Allan Poe, if you like. And the Gothic in English terms was ruined castles, people locked in dungeons, owls backlit by a full moon, and prisoners, and terrible goings on under the ordinary surface of life. And only at the end, the avuncular General Tilney pulls her up short. And this is my first reading. It's a tribute to Jane Austen. It's not quite a source for this novel because I'd already launched myself, but it's a parallel, it's an echo through time. Most writers live in a constant present with other writers. So here's Catherine Morland's comeuppance. The general turns to her and said, "Dear Miss Morland, consider the dreadful nature of the suspicions you have entertained. What have you been judging from? Remember the country and the age in which we live. Remember that we are English and that we are Christians. Consult your own understanding, your own sense of the probable, your own observation of what is passing around you. Does our education prepare us for such atrocities? Do our laws connive at them? Could they be perpetrated without being known in a country like this, where social and literary intercourse is on such a footing, where every man is surrounded by a neighborhood of voluntary spies, and where roads and newspapers lay everything open? Dearest Miss Morland, what ideas have you been admitting? They had reached the end of the gallery, and with tears of shame, she ran off to her room. Now, if I was looking for another title for Atonement, it would be that Believing is Seeing. Believing is seeing is what all of us, however much we might deny it, all do. We come with preconceptions, we impose old patterns on new patterns, we have ideologies, beliefs, political certainties that often make us not see what's in front of us. So Bryony was to carry the weight on her shoulders and right at her back, as an epigraph to Atonement, is Jane Austen. The play, for which Bryony had designed the posters, programs, and tickets, constructed a sales booth out of a folding screen tipped on its side, and lined the collection box in red crepe paper, was written by her in a 2-day tempest of composition, causing her to miss a breakfast and a lunch. And when the preparations were complete, she had nothing to do but contemplate her finished draft and wait for the appearance of her cousins from the distant north. There would be time for only 1 day of rehearsal before her brother arrived. At some moments chilling, at others desperately sad, the play told a tale of the heart, whose message, conveyed in a rhyming prologue, was that love which did not build a foundation on good sense was doomed. The reckless passion of the heroine, Arabella, for a wicked foreign count, is punished by ill fortune, when she contracts cholera during an impetuous dash towards a seaside town with her intended. Deserted by him and nearly everybody else, bedbound in a garret, she discovers in herself a sense of humor. Fortune presents herself a second chance in the form of an impoverished doctor, in fact, of course, a prince in disguise, who has elected to work amongst the needy. Healed by him, Arabella chooses judiciously this time and is rewarded by reconciliation with her family and a wedding with the medical prince on, quote, a windy, sunlit day in spring. Bryony's mother, Mrs. Tallis, read the 7 pages of the Trials of Arabella in her bedroom at her dressing table with the author's arm around her shoulder the whole while. Bryony studied her mother's face for every trace of shifting emotion, and Emily Tallis obliged with looks of alarm, snickers of glee, and at the end, grateful smiles and wise affirming nods. She took her daughter in her arms onto her lap. Ah, that hot, smooth little body. She remembered from its infancy, and still not gone from her, not quite yet. And she said that the play was stupendous, and agreed instantly, murmuring into the tight whirl of the girl's ear that this word could be quoted on the poster, which was to be on an easel in the entrance hall by the ticket booth. Bryony was hardly to know it at this point, but this was the project's highest point of fulfillment. Nothing came near it for satisfaction. All else was dreams and frustration. There were moments in the summer dusk after her light was out, burrowing in the delicious gloom of her canopy bed, when she made her heart thud with luminous, yearning fantasies, little playlets in themselves, every one of which featured Leon, her brother. In one, his big, good-natured face buckled in grief as Arabella sank in loneliness and despair. In another, there he was, cocktail in hand, at some fashionable city watering hole, overheard boasting to a group of friends, "Yes, my younger sister, Bryony Tallis, the writer, you must surely have heard of her." In a third, he punched the air in its exultation as the final curtain fell. although there was no curtain, there was no possibility of a curtain. Her play was not for her cousins, it was for her brother, to celebrate his return, provoke his admiration, and guide him away from his careless succession of girlfriends towards the right form of wife, the one who would persuade him to return to the countryside, the one who would sweetly request Bryony's services as a bridesmaid. So she is a very bright, very inventive, forthright, determined girl. And her sister is one of the lives she's going to ruin. And so I will read to you the passage that contains the very first paragraph that I wrote in a notebook somewhere in Holland, where I was taking my children for a long holiday and they were out of the house for a whole hour. The vase that Cecilia is to put these wildflowers in is actually a very precious vase that was brought back by an uncle in the First World War. It's a Meissen vase. She wants water for her vase. She wants to go and see this young man outside. At the same time, she doesn't. She's an unreflected turmoil of emotion about him. They've both been at Cambridge together. He's been put through it by her father. His mother is the cleaning lady. They've grown up together. She's almost stopped understanding who he is. Oh my God, go away. She finally makes up her mind not to go in the kitchen and get water for her vase, where it's the obvious place, but to go and confront him. Cecilia gripped the cool porcelain in both hands as she stood on one foot and with the other hooked the French windows wide open. As she stepped out into the brightness, the rising scent of warm stone was like a friendly embrace. 2 swallows were making passes over the fountain, and a chiff-chaff's song was piercing the air from within the sinewy gloom of the giant cedar of Lebanon. The flowers swung in the light breeze, tickling her face as she crossed the terrace and carefully negotiated the 3 crumbly steps down to the gravel path. Robbie turned suddenly at the sound of her approach. I was away in my thoughts, he began to explain. Would you roll me one of your Bolshevik cigarettes? He threw his own cigarette aside, took the tin which lay on his jacket on the lawn, and walked alongside her to the fountain, and they were silent for a while. Beautiful day, she then said through a sigh. He was looking at her with amused suspicion. There was something between them, and even as she had to acknowledge that a tame remark about the weather sounded perverse, she listened neutrally as he said, how's the novel? How's Clarissa? He was looking down at his fingers, rolling the tobacco. Boring, she said. We mustn't say so. Celia said, I wish she'd get on with it. She does, and it gets better. They slowed, then stopped so that he could put the finishing touches to her roll-up. She said, I'd rather read Fielding any day. She felt she had said something stupid. Robbie was looking away across the park and the cows towards the oak wood that lined the river valley, the wood she had run through that morning. He might be thinking she was talking to him in code, suggestively conveying her taste for the full-blooded and sensual. That was a mistake, of course, and she was discomforted and had no idea how to put him right. She liked his eyes, she thought. The unblended mix of orange and green made even more granular in sunlight. And she liked the fact that he was so tall. It was an interesting combination in a man, she thought, intelligence and sheer bulk. Cecilia had taken the cigarette and he was lighting it for her. I know what you mean, he said as they walked the remaining few yards to the fountain. There's more life in Fielding, but he can be psychologically crude compared to Richardson. She set down the vase by the uneven steps that rose to the fountain's stone basin. The last thing she wanted was an undergraduate debate on 18th century literature. She didn't think Fielding was crude at all, or that Richardson was a fine psychologist, but she wasn't going to be drawn in, defending, defining, attacking. She was tired of all that. And Robbie was tenacious in arguing. Instead, she said, Leon's coming today, did you know? I heard a rumor, he said. That's marvelous. And he's bringing a friend, this man, Paul Marshall. Oh, yes, the chocolate millionaire. No, you're going to give him flowers. She smiled. Was he pretending to be jealous to conceal the fact that he was? She no longer understood him. They had fallen out of touch at Cambridge. It had been too difficult to do anything else. She changed the subject. The old man says you're going to be a doctor. I'm thinking about it. You must love the student life. He looked away again, but this time for only a second or less. And when he turned to her, she thought she saw a touch of irritation. Had she sounded condescending? She saw his eyes again, green and orange flecks, like a boy's marble. When he spoke, he was perfectly pleasant. I know you never like that sort of thing, see, but how else do you become a doctor? That's my point. 6 years, why do it? But he wasn't offended. She was the one who was over-interpreting and jittery in his presence, and she was annoyed with herself. He was taking her question seriously. No one's really going to give me work as a landscape gardener. I don't want to teach or go in for the civil service, and medicine interests me. He broke off as a thought occurred to him. Look, I've agreed to pay your father back. That's the arrangement. That's not what I meant at all. She was surprised that he should think she was raising the question of money. That was ungenerous of him. Her father had subsidized Robbie's education all his life. Had anyone ever objected? She had thought she was imagining it, but in fact, she was right. There was something trying in Robbie's manner lately. He had a way of wrong-footing her whenever he could. 2 days before, he had rung the front doorbell, in itself odd, for he had always had the freedom of the house. And when she was called down, he was standing outside, asking in a loud, impersonal voice if he could borrow a book. As it happened, Polly, the maid, was on all fours washing the tiles in the entrance hall. Robbie made a great show of removing his boots, which weren't dirty at all, and then, as an afterthought, took his socks off as well, and tiptoed with comic exaggeration across the wet floor. Everything he did was designed to distance her. He was play acting the cleaning lady's son come to the big house on an errand. They went into the library together, and when he had found his book, she asked him to stay for a coffee. It was a pretense, his dithering refusal. He was one of the most confident people she'd ever met. She was being mocked, she knew. Rebuffed, she had left the room and went upstairs and lay on the bed with Clarissa and read without taking in a word, feeling her irritation and confusion grow. She was being mocked. She was being mocked, or she was being punished. She did not know which was worse. Punished for being in a different circle at Cambridge, for not having a charlady for a mother, mocked for her poor degree, not that they actually awarded degrees to women anyway. Awkwardly, for she still had her cigarette, she picked up the vase and balanced it on the rim of the basin. It would have made better sense to take the flowers out first, but she was too irritable. Her hands were hot and dry, and she had to grip the porcelain all the tighter. Robbie was silent, but she could tell from his expression, a forced, stretched smile that did not part his lips, that he regretted what he had said. That was no comfort either. This was what happened when they talked these days. One or the other was always in the wrong, trying to call back the last remark. There was no ease, no stability in the course of their conversations, no chance to relax. Instead, it was spikes, traps, and awkward turns that caused her to dislike herself almost as much as she disliked him, though she did not doubt that he was mostly to blame. She hadn't changed, but there was no question that he had. He was putting distance between himself and the family that had been completely open to him and given him everything. And for this reason alone, expectation of his refusal and her own displeasure in advance, she had not invited him to dinner that night. If he wanted distance, then let him have it. Of the 4 dolphins whose tails supported the shell on which the Triton squatted, the one nearest to Cecilia had in its wide open mouth stocked with moss and algae. Its spherical stone eyeballs, as big as apples, were iridescent green. The whole statue had acquired around its northerly surfaces a bluish-green patina, so that from certain approaches and in low light, the muscle-bound Triton really seemed 100 leagues under the sea. Bernini's intention must have been for the water to trickle musically from the wide shell with its irregular edges into the basin below, but the pressure was too weak, so that instead the water slid soundlessly down the underside of the shell, where opportunistic slime hung in dripping points like stalactites in a limestone cave. The basin itself was over 3 feet deep and clear. The bottom was of a pale cream stone over which undulating white-edged rectangles of refracted sunlight divided and overlapped. Her idea was to lean over the parapet and hold the flowers in the vase while she lowered it on its side into the water. But it was at this point that Robbie, wanting to make amends, tried to be helpful. "Let me take that," he said, stretching out a hand. "I'll fill it for you and you take the flowers. I can manage, thanks." She was already holding the vase over the basin. But he said, "Look, I've got it." And he had, tightly between forefinger and thumb. "Your cigarette will get wet. Take the flowers." This was a command on which he tried to confer urgent masculine authority. The effect on Cecilia was to cause her to tighten her grip. She had no time and certainly no inclination to explain that plunging vase and flowers into the water would help with the natural look she wanted in the arrangement. She tightened her hold and twisted her body away from him. He was not so easily shaken off. And so, with a sound like a dry twig snapping, a section of the lip of the vase came away in his hand and split into 2 triangular pieces, which dropped into the water and tumbled to the bottom in a synchronous seesawing motion and lay there several inches apart, writhing in the broken light. Cecilia and Robbie froze in the attitude of their struggle. Their eyes met, and what she saw in the bilious melange of green and orange was not shock or guilt, but a form of challenge or even triumph. She had the presence of mind to set the ruined vase back down on the step before letting herself confront the significance of the accident. It was irresistible, she knew, even delicious, for the graver it was, the worse it would be for Robbie. Her dead uncle, her father's dear brother, the wasteful war, the treacherous crossing of the river with the vase, preciousness beyond money, the heroism and goodness, all the years backed up behind the history of the vase, reaching back to the genius of Horold and beyond him to the mastery of the arcanists who had reinvented porcelain. "You idiot," she said, "look what you've done." He looked into the water. Then he looked back at her and simply shook his head as he raised a hand to cover his mouth. By this gesture, he assumed full responsibility. But at that moment, she hated him for the inadequacy of the response. He glanced towards the basin and sighed. For a moment, he thought she was about to step backwards onto the vase, and he raised his hand and pointed, though he said nothing. But instead, he began to unbutton his shirt. Immediately, oh my God, sorry, I'm going to throw this out of the room. Sorry about that. Couldn't turn it off. By this gesture, he assumed full responsibility. But at that moment, she hated him for the inadequacy of the response. He glanced towards the basin and sighed. And for a moment, he thought she was about to step backwards onto the vase, and he raised his hand and pointed, though he said nothing. Instead, he began to unbutton his shirt. Immediately, she knew what he was about. Intolerable. He had come to the house and removed his shoes and socks. Well, she would show him then. She kicked off her sandals, unbuttoned her blouse and removed it, unfastened her skirt and stepped out of it, and went to the basin wall. He stood with hands on hips and stared as she climbed into the water in her underwear. Denying his help, any possibility of making amends, was his punishment. The unexpectedly freezing water that caused her to gasp was his punishment. She held her breath and sank, leaving her hair fanned out across the surface. Drowning herself would be his punishment. When she emerged a few seconds later with a piece of pottery in each hand, he knew better than to offer to help her out of the water. The frail white nymph, from whom water cascaded far more successfully than it did from the beefy Triton, carefully placed the pieces by the vase. She dressed quickly, turning her wet arms with difficulty through her silk sleeves and tucking the unfastened blouse into the skirt. She picked up her sandals and thrust them under her arm, put the fragments in the pocket of her skirt, and took up the vase. Her movements were savage. And she would not meet his eye, for it did not exist. He was banished, and this was also the punishment. He stood there dumbly as she walked away from him, barefoot across the lawn. And he watched her darkened hair swing heavily across her shoulders, drenching her blouse. Then he turned and looked into the water in case there was a piece she had missed. It was difficult to see because the roiling surface had yet to recover its tranquility, and the turbulence was driven by the lingering spirit of her fury. He put her hand flat upon the surface as though to quell it. She, meanwhile, had disappeared into the house. There is, in the placing of a camera or the writing of a scene, a term called the reverse. And I'm going to read to you the same scene again. Many of the elements of the first part of this novel are seen through different characters' eyes in a completely new perspective. And probably the only time in my life I've ever named a character with any sense of meaning is in this novel. Thomas Tallis was the great English composer famed for his polyphony being many separate sounds like counterpoint interweaving themselves around each other. And the fact that we see the events of this part unfold from the point of view of Bryony, from Cecilia, from Robbie, and from Mrs. Tallis is essential to the narrative technique. So Bryony, with her overheated imagination, is going to make a terrible mistake. And this is really going to be the origins of this mistake, what she witnesses. She's been rehearsing her play with the two little boys, twins, and her 15-year-old cousin, Lola, and everyone's got bored and fed up. The twins have gone off, Lola has vanished, and Bryony is left all alone in the nursery where they've been rehearsing. Bryony sat on the floor with her back to one of the tall built-in toy cupboards and fanned her face with the pages of her play. The silence in the house was complete. No voices or footfalls downstairs, no murmurs from the plumbing. In the space between one of the open sash windows, a trapped fly had abandoned its struggle. And outside, the liquid birdsong had evaporated in the heat. She pushed her knees out straight before her and let the folds of her white muslin dress and the familiar, endearing pucker of skin about her knees fill her view. She should have changed her dress this morning. She knew that. And it's so much trouble. She thought she should take more care of her appearance, like Lola did, It was childish not to, but what an effort it was. The silence hissed in her ears, and her vision was faintly distorted. Her hands in her lap appeared unusually large, and at the same time remote, as though viewed across an immense distance. She raised one hand and flexed its fingers and wondered, as she had sometimes before, how this thing, this machine for gripping, this fleshy spider on the end of her arm, came to be hers, entirely at her command. Or did it have some little life of its own? She bent her finger and straightened it. The mystery was in the instant before it moved, the dividing moment between not moving and moving, when her intention took effect. It was like a wave breaking. If she could only find herself at the crest, she thought, she might find the secret of herself, that part of her that was really in charge. She brought her forefinger closer to her face and stared at it, urging it to move. It remained still because she was pretending. She was not entirely serious. And because willing it to move or being about to move it was not the same as actually moving it. And when she did crook it finally, the action seemed to start in her finger, in the finger itself, not in some part of her mind. When did it know to move? When did she know to move it? There was no catching herself out. It was either or. There was no stitching, no seam. And yet she knew that behind the smooth, continuous fabric was the real self. Was it her soul? It was the real self which took the decision to cease pretending and give the final command. These thoughts were familiar to her, and as comforting as the precise configuration of her knees, their matching but competing symmetrical and reversible look. A second thought always followed the first. One mystery bred another. Was everyone else really as alive as she was? For example, did her sister really matter to herself? Was she so valuable to herself as Bryony was? Was being Cecilia just as vivid an affair as being Bryony? Did her sister also have a real self concealed behind a breaking wave? And did she spend time thinking about it with a finger held up to her face? Did everybody, including her father and Betty, the chambermaid and Harding? If the answer was yes, then the world, the social world, was unbearably complicated, with 2 billion voices and everyone's thoughts striving in equal importance, and everyone's claim on life as intense, and everyone thinking they were unique when no one was. One could drown in irrelevance. But if the answer was no, then Bryony was surrounded by machines, intelligent and pleasant enough on the outside, but lacking the bright and private inside feeling she had. This was sinister and lonely as well, and also unlikely. For though it had offended her sense of order, she knew it was overwhelmingly probable that everyone else had thoughts like hers. She knew this, but only in a rather arid way. She didn't really feel it. The rehearsals also offended her sense of order. The self-contained world she had drawn with clear and perfect lines had been defaced with the scribble of other minds, other needs, and time itself, so easily sectioned on paper into acts and scenes, was even now dribbling uncontrollably away. Perhaps she wouldn't get Jackson back until after lunch. Leon and his friend were arriving in the early evening, or even sooner, and the performance was set for 7 o'clock, and still there had been no proper rehearsal, and the twins could not act or even speak, and Lola had stolen Bryony's rightful role, and nothing could be managed, and it was hot, ludicrously hot. The girl squirmed in her oppression and stood. Dust from along the skirting board had dirtied her hands and the back of her dress. Away in her thoughts, she wiped her palms down her front as she went towards the window. The simplest way to have impressed Leon would have been to write him a story and put it in her hands herself and watch as he read it. The title lettering, the illustrated cover, The pages bound. In that word alone, she felt the attraction of the neat, limited and controllable form she had left behind to write a play. The story was direct and simple, allowing nothing to come between herself and her reader. No intermediaries with their private ambitions or incompetence, no pressures of time, no limits on resources. In a story, you only had to wish, you only had to write it down and you could have the world. In a play, you had to make do with what was available. No horses, no village streets, no seaside, no curtain. It seemed so obvious now that it's too late. A story was a form of telepathy. By means of inking symbols onto a page, she was able to send thoughts and feelings from her mind to her readers. It was a magical process, so commonplace that no one stopped to wonder at it. Reading a sentence and understanding it were the same thing. As with the crooking of her finger, nothing lay between them. There was no gap during which the symbols were unraveled. You saw the word castle, and it was there, seen from some distance, with woods in high summer spread before it, the air bluish and soft with smoke rising from the blacksmith's forge, and a cobbled road twisting away into the green shade. She had arrived at one of the nursery's wide open windows. And she must have seen what lay before her some seconds before she registered it. It was a scene that could easily have accommodated in the distance, at least a medieval castle. Some miles beyond the Talus's land rose the Surrey hills, and their motionless crowds of thick-crested oaks, their greens softened by a milky heat haze. And then nearer the estate's open parkland, which today had a dry and savage look, roasting like a savanna, where isolated trees threw harsh, stumpy shadows, and the long grass was already stalked by the leonine yellow of high summer. Closer, within the boundaries of the balustrade, were the rose gardens, and nearer still, the Triton fountain, and standing by the basin's retaining wall was her sister, and right before her was Robbie Turner. There was something rather formal about the way he stood, feet apart, head held back. A proposal of marriage. Bryony would not have been surprised. She herself had written a tale in which a humble woodcutter saved a princess from drowning and ended by marrying her. What was presented here fitted well. Robbie Turner, only son of a humble cleaning lady and of no known father, Robbie, who had been subsidized by Bryony's father through school and university, had wanted to be a landscape gardener and now wanted to take up medicine, had the boldness of ambition to ask for Cecilia's hand. It made perfect sense. Such leaps across boundaries were the stuff of daily romance. What was less comprehensible, however, was how Robbie imperiously raised his hand now, as though issuing a command which Cecilia dare not disobey. It was extraordinary that she was unable to resist him. At his insistence, she was removing her clothes, and at such speed. She was out of her blouse, and now she had let her skirt drop to the ground and was stepping out of it while he looked on impatiently, hands on hips. What strange power did he have over her? Blackmail? Threats? Bryony raised two hands to her face and stepped back a little way from the window. She should shut her eyes, she thought, and spare herself the sight of her sister's shame. But that was impossible, because there were further surprises. Celia, mercifully still in her underwear, was climbing into the pond, was standing waist deep in the water, was pinching her nose. And then she was gone. There was only Robbie and the clothes on the gravel, and beyond the silent park and the distant blue hills. The sequence was illogical. The drowning scene, followed by a rescue, should have preceded the marriage proposal. Such was Bryony's last thought before she accepted that she did not understand and that she must simply watch. Unseen from 2 stories up, with the benefit of unambiguous sunlight, she had privileged access across the years to adult behavior, to rights and conventions she knew nothing about as yet. Clearly, These were the kinds of things that happened. Even as her sister's head broke the surface, thank God, Bryony had her first weak intimation that for her now it could no longer be fairy tale castles and princesses, but the strangeness of the here and now, of what passed between people, the ordinary people that she knew, and what power one could have over the other, and how easy it was to get everything wrong, completely wrong. Cecilia had climbed out of the pond and was fixing her skirt, and with difficulty pulling her blouse on over her wet skin. She turned abruptly and picked up from the deep shade of the fountain's wall a vase of flowers. Bryony had not seen them before, and Cecilia set off with it towards the house. No words were exchanged with Robbie, not a glance in his direction. He was now staring into the water, and then he too was striding away, no doubt satisfied, round the side of the house. Suddenly, the scene was empty. The wet patch on the ground where Cecilia had got out of the pond was the only evidence that anything had happened at all. So I'm going to jump ahead now and finally read to you two very short pieces. If you haven't read the novel, you should know that the twins go missing. They run away. Everybody in the house goes out looking for them. And by this time now, Bryony, who has interrupted Robbie and Cecilia making love in the library and mistakes it for a violent assault, has completely fixed in her mind that Robbie is a villain. And so when Lola is discovered to have been assaulted in the dark of the park while they were looking for the twins, it is Bryony who goes to Lola's rescue as a figure in the dark scurries away. It is Bryony who announces to the family and to the police who visit that the man who raped Lola was most certainly Robbie. And this is the error of perception. She is primed by her own overheated imagination. This is the mistake that Bryony will now spend the rest of her life and in many successions of the novel trying to correct, trying to atone. So as they go out into the park, Bryony's excitement and certainty about Robbie and just the overheated nature of her imagination is actually expressed not only in the mind, but in the body. Within the half hour, Bryony would commit her crime. Conscious that she was sharing the night expanse with a maniac, she kept close to the shadowed walls of the house at first and ducked low beneath the sills whenever she passed in front of a lighted window. She knew he would be heading off down the main drive because that was the way her sister had gone with Leon. As soon as she thought a safe distance had opened up, Bryony swung out boldly from the house in a wide arc that took her towards the stable block and the swimming pool. It made sense, surely, to see if the twins were there, fooling around with the hoses, or floating face down in death, indistinguishable to the last. She thought how she might describe it, the way they bobbed on the illuminated water's gentle swell, and how their hair spread like tendrils and their clothed bodies softly collided and drifted apart. The dry night air slipped between the fabric of her dress and her skin, and she felt smooth and agile in the dark. There was nothing she could not describe. The gentle pad of a maniac's tread moving sinuously along the drive, keeping to the verge to muffle his approach. But her brother was with Cecilia, and that was a burden lifted. But she could describe this delicious air too, the grasses giving off their sweet cattle smell, the hard-fired earth which still held the embers of the day's heat and exhaled the mineral odor of clay, and the faint breeze carrying from the lake a flavor of green and silver. She broke into a loping run across the grass and thought she could go on all night, knifing through the silky air, sprung forwards by the steely coil of the hard ground under her feet, and by the way darkness doubled the impression of speed. She had dreams in which she ran like this, then tilted forwards, spread her arms, and yielding to faith, the only difficult part, but easy enough in sleep, left the ground by simply stepping off it, and swooped low over hedges and gates and roofs, and then hurtled upwards and hovered exultantly below the cloud base, above the fields, before diving down again. She sensed now how this might be achieved, through desire alone. The world she ran through loved her and would give her what she wanted and would let it happen. And then when it did, she would describe it. Wasn't writing a kind of soaring, an achievable form of flight, of fancy, of the imagination? So she comes back, she makes her accusation. And here, I'm going to cut short a little and just read. The police have arrived. The senior inspector had a heavy face, rich in seams, as though carved from folded granite. Bryony was fearful of him as she told her story to this watchful, unmoving mask. And as she did so, she felt a weight lifting from her and a warm, submissive feeling spread from her stomach to her limbs. It was like love, a sudden love for this watchful man who stood unquestioningly for the cause of goodness, who came out at all hours to do battle in its name, and who was backed by all the human powers and wisdom that existed. Under his neutral gaze, her throat constricted and her voice began to buckle. She wanted the inspector to embrace her and comfort her and forgive her, however guiltless she was, but he would only look at her and listen. She kept saying, "It was him. I saw him." Her tears were further proof of the truth she felt and spoke, and when her mother's hand caressed her nape, she broke down completely and was led towards the drawing room. At this early stage, she comes back, at this early stage, the inspector was careful not to oppress the young girl with probing questions. And within this sensitively created space, she was able to build and shape her narrative in her own words and establish the key facts. There was just sufficient light for her to recognize a familiar face. When he shrank away from her and circled the clearing, his movements and height were familiar to her as well. The inspector said, "You saw him then? I know it was him. Let's forget what you know. You're saying you saw him." "Yes, I saw him, just as you saw me, just as you see me." "Yes, you saw him with your own eyes." "Yes, I saw him, I saw him." And thus her first formal interview was concluded. And there I'll stop. And I'm sorry about my my phone.
Oh, it's no problem at all.
I can't hear anything.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
I think you're muted at your end. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Do you need to turn the volume up on your device? Just one moment.
Hold on. I got it.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I just have to adjust that. Okay, I can hear you now.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
So our first question is from Ralph, who says, "Mr. McEwan, I'm struck by how much you enjoy reading your own work out loud. Did you feel this delighted when you first wrote it? And can you give us some thoughts about how important the role of joy is in the writing process?"
Well, I often, when I'm in the middle of writing a book, read from work in progress. there's a huge difference between the silent communion or even reading to yourself in the middle of the day, just to get the taste of things and how it sounds and what the rhythm of sentences is like. But the difference of reading to an audience, even if it's only an audience of one, and I often read to Annalena, my wife, that difference is really dramatic. I think it's the business of, just as we often see ourselves reflected in other people's eyes, I think we do the same with our ears. We imagine them hearing it. You imagine the other person. You don't have to be looking, as Bryony does, towards her mother for wise affirming nods or laughter. You just have to have attention. And that attention is a kind of text in itself. And you hear yourself differently. So it is a pleasure to read. There's a physical problem reading Zoom, and I really need to correct this. The camera is there, the page is down here. You glance at the camera at the risk of losing your place on the page, and yet somehow that eye contact, which is so good and so important in a live reading, in a live event, is somewhat lost. Having a phone that goes off, it wasn't ringing, it was some fault with the alarm, is also not great. But yes, there is a pleasure in reading aloud. When I started writing, readings were largely confined to poets. And only slowly during my writing career has the reading by a novelist become a commonplace. But I read to myself more or less every paragraph as I write it. And yes, it's not only a pleasure, it's sometimes a pain. I mean, you realize something's completely wrong with it, but it's a necessity.
Thank you. Our next question is from Isabel, who asks, when you make changes and deviate from the scaffolding of a novel, do you notice that the subject you are writing about brings up personal feelings that steer the story? Or does a fully fleshed out character, such as Bryony, appear that takes the reins and acts as the story's center of gravity, taking even you for a ride?
Well, very much the latter. My scaffolds are very flimsy, I have to say. For example, I didn't know what Bryony's big mistake was going to be. I just knew that she was going to be the one who would bear it. I mentioned before that question, where do you get your ideas from? Well, I mean, a novel is a million ideas, and you can't have them all at the beginning. It's very much like a painting. I mean, we know from going to galleries how much is painted over, and X-ray scholarship gives us all the palimpsests of great paintings, and the mind changes. So deviation is actually the name of the game, and the pursuit of a morning's work is to surprise oneself, to find something that you didn't know was there before. That's probably the greatest pleasure in writing, I find, is when you have something at midday that you didn't even dream of at 9 o'clock in the morning. So yes, I've written maybe 2 short novels that had scaffolds, and it's possible with a novella. But when you're contemplating 150,000 words, I really have a back of an envelope route map, as if I'm going up the Orinoco with more or less an idea of what I want, but I'll see things along the way, and one thing will breed another. And this will be the million ideas that one looks for.
Thank you. Our next question is from Barbara, who asks, I'm intrigued by the different period-appropriate styles for the different sections of Atonement. Did you plan that from the start or come to it as you worked through the book?
Again, I came to it. It's a good question. Atonement is structured around one novel of about 65,000 words and 2 novellas. It was very helpful for me within, the first 10,000 words to know that was the structure. 1935, that hot summer, well, I should start it again. I should say somewhere along the way, quite early on, I realized that Bryony was writing this book. And this was a fantastic liberation. I could do things that I'd never done before. Describe things that I never bothered with: sunsets, a baking field, the Surrey Hills, largely extraneous in the fiction in which I'm not impersonating anyone else. But here, after a while, I realized I was impersonating an elderly lady novelist, not of the modernist school. She tangles with modernism. It doesn't suit her. She gets a telling off from a well-known critic, Cyril Connolly. She goes back to her figures by the fountain and writes it with the smack of authority and proper narrative and motivation. So the question is very apt. That was a completely different style to when Robbie becomes the focus of the narrative, and it's his consciousness, and he's not a writer. Again, of course, I know that Bryony is constructing this from letters that are in the Imperial War Museum, so I still have to give her her due, but she is impersonating Robbie. Then we are in St. Thomas's Hospital, and 18-year-old Bryony is a nurse, and injured soldiers are coming back from Dunkirk. And here again, Bryony, the elderly lady, is remembering. And so there's great attention to medical detail and for a kind of emotional drive that the longer first part doesn't have. So yes, the material dictates the voice one takes up. It's as simple as that. It's no great trick. One simply responds to the material that's right there in front of you. And it was, and again, I'd never described a sunset in fiction before. I'd always been very snooty about doing it. But actually, it was a liberation. Wonderful to get out of the shadow of the great giants of modernism, who of course didn't stoop to sunsets either.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. Alicia asks, what have you learned over time about what it means to be sorry and atone?
Well, I was making a list the other day. I think something I've been meaning to do for years. And I called the list, courtesy of Joyce, the Eigenbite of Inwit. It sounds an impenetrable phrase, but Eigen is again, bite is literally bite of inwit, reflection. A wonderful Norse phrase that Joyce refers to in Ulysses. I was thinking of all those moments when I'm walking down the street and some bit of my past comes back to me. And before I know it, I've gone, out loud. Something I did that I can't call back. Often something really trivial. Not sending someone to prison who was innocent. My shout would be louder for that, I guess. And what I've learned, if that's the question, is you can't call back the deeds. I can see why religions exist, especially the Christian religion, in which people might ask for and feel they've got forgiveness. It seems a very easy way out to me to let yourself off the hook this way. There is, right at the end of this novel, when Bryony is now diagnosed with a terminal disease, she doesn't have long to live. And she's been writing atonement for almost 60 years. And you are reading the final draft in which the lovers, Robbie and Cecilia, are united and they forgive Bryony. And then in a coda, Bryony, the elderly dying novelist, lets us know that it wasn't the truth. And many people, of course, have disliked this ending thoroughly. And the more they dislike it, the more I feel justified in having written it, because it shows how heavily invested they were in what they thought was the case. And as Bryony says, there's always going to be the kind of reader who says, what really happened? Well, Bryony says to herself, and this is in the last couple of paragraphs of the novel, the problem these 59 years has been this: how can a novelist achieve atonement when, with her absolute power of deciding outcomes, she is also God? There is no one, no entity or higher form that she can appeal to or be reconciled with, or that can forgive her. There is nothing outside her. In her imagination, she has set the limits and the terms. No atonement for God or novelists, even if they are atheists. It was always an impossible task, and that was precisely the point. The attempt was all. So to come back to the question, Bryony can't have atonement for her 60-year effort to meditate on her error, the silliness, the overheated imagination that sent a man to jail and wrecked a love affair. But she spent 60 years trying, 59 years trying, and the attempt was all. And it reminds me of Henry James' formulation of the examined life. She did at least lead the examined life. And my answer to the question, therefore, is all you can do is contemplate, reflect, make your list of the egg and bite of Inwit, if you care to or dare. That's the only atonement you can have. You probably won't forgive yourself, but the attempt is all.
Thank you so much. I'll pass it back to Andrew.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you very, very much, Ian, for those marvellous answers to the questions, which I found fascinating, but actually very moving as well. Thank you so much. And especially, of course, too, for the reading itself. It was really wonderful to be taken back to those scenes, which I thought, as well as having their intrinsic interest, of course, were a kind of masterclass in how to combine thinking about themes through the characters with the embodiment of those themes in physical descriptions of one kind or another, including sunsets. But also fascinating as well to think about how the actions undertaken by those characters early in the novel anticipate, without their knowing, all sorts of things that are going to follow as a result of the actions taken there. So marvelous in every respect. Thank you very, very much. And thank you, Kate and Gabriella, for helping organize this evening very much. Thank you, audience. I realize, of course, that we're all about to disappear for spring break, but I look forward very much to seeing you at our next gathering, which will be on the 5th of April at 6 o'clock for our annual reading by recent graduates of the MFA programme. The poets Alexis Sears and Matthew Smith will be with us. And I'm delighted to say that event will be held in person in Gilman 50, so make sure you get there nice and early for that. But thank you again, Ian, very, very much for this evening. Thank you all, and look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and thank you for the marvellous questions.